Now let's look at the Scrum process itself. So here you see the Scrum roles. We're going to take a look now at more of the details of the process, and then we'll look at the backlog and how you make this real. So we really have some main events that happen. Up front, the Scrum Master will work with the product owner to do the initial planning, to update the product backlog, make sure that it's clear, make sure that definition of done is clear, the user stories are clear, and that backlog has been prioritized by the product owner based on the needs of the business. From there, we go into our main events, which is the sprint planning meeting, our daily cycle, so you hear that called daily stand-up, etc., the daily scrum. Our goal is to release the product increment, and that can be one or more increments that make up a release. It depends on how you plan your final release into production. However, this is intended to be a releasable increment. We have the sprint review meeting, which is the third key event. So this is where you do demos and get feedback. And then finally, a retrospective, where this is the opportunity to inspect and adapt for your next sprint cycle. So let's take a look in a bit more detail of what these main activities are. So the sprint itself, it is at the heart of Scrum. It's recommended it is 1 month or less, okay? And that is your time box for creating the increment. It contains the sprint planning, the daily stand-ups, all of the work to create the increment, so the development work, the sprint review, and the sprint retrospective. So if you start with your planning, you end with your retrospective, then you go into the next sprint. Okay? That is really in the core of what you're determining. Do we do 2-week sprints? Do we do 3-week sprints? Do we do 4-week sprints, etc.? Don't go longer than 4 weeks. Otherwise, you're starting to get more into a more traditional waterfall and or project managed approach as you work through. There are some rules around here, and the rules are important because they do facilitate this agility that we're all trying to achieve, this responsiveness to the business. So sprint planning then, the sprint planning session, a very, very important session. Prior session, the product owner and the Scrum Master have worked together to build out that product backlog. Oftentimes, the development team, as part of their retrospective and even part of the sprint itself, will spend some time grooming, what we say, grooming the product backlog. That is reading through, making sure it's clear, working with the product manager if a user story isn't clear, definition of doesn't isn't clear. And once that work is done up front, you're ready for your main first sprint event, which is called sprint planning. And sprint planning is where the team is going to figure out 2 things. One is they're going to figure out what to do. So what are they going to do in the sprint? So they're going to take items out of the product backlog and commit to delivering them, and those items become part of the sprint backlog. Okay, so the sprint backlog is just a smaller subset of the product backlog, but the sprint backlog becomes the key focus and that the development team has committed to deliver in this particular sprint. So as part of not only identifying what they are going to work on in the sprint planning meeting, they're also going to identify a few of the high-level tasks of how to do it, how they're going to organize themselves to deliver in this sprint. It's oftentimes, the sprint planning session is oftentimes the first time that your team has come together. They might not work together. They might not have experienced Scrum before. So you may want to look at preceding the sprint planning meeting if you have a brand new team with some education or some type of kickoff for the team, just so that they have an awareness of what they're getting into, what they've signed up for, how things will work prior to coming to the sprint planning session. So just to reiterate, the sprint planning meeting, the first key event in a sprint. It's a meeting in two parts. To define the sprint, your input is the product backlog. If you've got some past performance on the team capacity, you can include that. Business conditions, technology stability, most recent product increments. So that's assuming you've gone through this before. And that's where the team will review, consider, and organize themselves to come up with an agreement on what is the sprint goal and defining that sprint backlog. So what are we going to work on and how are we going to work on it? Okay. This is typically time boxed. We've got another slide that will show all the time boxes, but this is time boxed as 8 hours. This is 8 hours spent together as a team, and highly, highly recommended that it's face-to-face. Okay. I'll talk about the challenges with remote sprinting at the end of this as well.